Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. My name is Hudrian Shah. I'm a PhD student at the Faculty of Islamic Studies. Today, I will be a moderator for this talk. So, welcome to our book forum. It's my great pleasure to have all of you here for engaging in our discussion today. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge library and also Professor Shafiq Hashim as the director for facilitating our event this afternoon. Today we gather here to discuss a fascinating and important work titled Defending Traditional Islam in Indonesia, The Resurgence of Hadrami Preacher. This book is originated from Professor Rijal dissertation at the Australian National University, 2016, and it just published several months ago. This is really a new book. Congratulations, Prof. Rijal. And this book provide a profound exploration of the dynamic of Hadrami preachers and its significant impact on traditional Islam in Indonesia. And we are honored to have with us here Professor Samsul Rijal, the author of this insightful book. Thank you very much for your time, Prof. Rijal. So Professor Rijal is a distinguished scholar on sociology, and I think also anthropology of Islam, and he is a lecturer at the Faculty of Islamic Studies, IIIU, and also at the Faculty of Da'wah and Communication, Win Sharif Hidayatullah. And his work on Hadrami preachers that we are going to discuss today is shed light on a pivotal aspect of Indonesian Islam that, of course, offering infallible perspective on contemporary religious dynamic. And also, we are very lucky to have a distinguished anthropologist, a prominent scholar here, Professor Martin van Bruynesen. Thank you very much for your time and welcome again to IIIU. I think we are very familiar with Prof. Martin. Let me introduce shortly. So Professor Martin is an emeritus professor of comparative study of contemporary Muslim societies at Utrecht University. He is conducting extensive field research in several countries like Kurdistan, Afghanistan, and Indonesia. His work integrate history and politics, and also 9 years of research and teaching in Indonesia. So he already Indonesian, and he's very good in bahasa, of course. So today Professor Martin will be a discussion and will involve in discussing the content of the book, and I think also post thought-provoking debate or discussion as well. Well, we will start with a presentation first from Professor Rijal, and then followed by discussion from Professor Martin. Afterward, we will open a Q&A session for the audience. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Rijal to deliver your presentation. Please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. This time I would like to say thanks to our director, Triple IU director, library director, Dr. Shafiq Hashim, for having me this afternoon. Okay. Yeah, check sound. See clear? Also, we have Professor or Pak Martin. Yeah, I think he is very familiar to us. Yeah, he is considered as a guru of Indonesian Islam. Yeah, especially among lecturers at PTKIN. Also, dear participants here, thank you for your coming. Yeah, in this opportunity, I'm very happy to present my new book, published by Routledge. Let me begin by sharing just an introduction about this book. So, this book, as our moderator mentioned, originates from PhD thesis at the Australian National University. I submitted in 2016, so I think it's already 8 years now. And at the time, I was supervised by Pak Martin's colleague, Dr. Greg Feely, Professor Emeritus Greg Feely at the Australian National University. Yeah. Actually, I have published many chapters, several articles derived from my thesis. But later, at the time, I didn't find a way how to publish in any publication overseas until 2 years ago. My colleague Yanor Pribadi informed me about the new project by Ministry of Religious Affairs. Yeah, there is one project on Islam and Muslim societies in Indonesia. Yeah, so they have concern to publish any books related to Indonesian Islam. So this book is the second book of this project. The first one by Alfitri, who is now lecturer in Kalimantan. Okay. If we have seen social media today, you can see many heated debates and discussion on Ba'lawi or Habaib. Yeah. I know many of you are waiting for this, response. But actually, my book actually only cover a period. I mean, in 2012 and 2013. So I did my fieldwork in this period. Yeah. I start collecting data on December 2012, and then 1 year later, in 2013. At the time, what led me to do research on these Hadrami preachers. Actually, I was curious to see, before doing my PhD, I always, observe many banners and billboards around Jakarta, also big cities in Indonesia, in Surabaya, Solo, Jogja, and so on. And then I was quite curious to know why now, why there are too many, there are too many sermon groups. Using new media, using billboards, banners, and so on in big cities, where big cities are identical with modern people, while traditionalists, if we hear the term traditionalists, it's identical with villages, rural societies, and so on. So at that time, I was wondering how these sermons proliferated in big cities, and why did they get many followers? Yeah, at the time, maybe thousand followers in Jakarta. Yeah, at the time we remember there are two largest sermon groups in Jakarta, Majelis Rasulullah and Nurul Mustafa, and I think the two leaders already passed away in the young age. The first one is the late Habib Munzir al-Musawa. When I did my research, he passed away in the middle of my research, so I didn't have chance to meet him, but I have interviewed many of his staff and his friends, as well as his followers. And then the second one, Habib Hassan, yeah, also has passed away, I think last year or this year. Yeah. Still young age, and both had 1,000 followers. And at the time, during this period, I mean, maybe in my book I focus on the post New Order era. Yeah, I argue that this kind of activity actually have grown after the post New Order era. So this is something new. Yeah. So and I was wondering what happens here, because they succeed in mobilizing young followers in the cities. Yeah, they have their own identity through jackets, also convoy, and so on. So they have several symbols, and it seems many sermon groups, yeah, as if they compete each other to attract followers in Jakarta. Yeah, maybe before going to my case, maybe as a background, I think it's better to remember about the term here, about Hadrami. Yeah, I think when we hear the term Hadrami, I think it is obvious that it means people who comes from or originates from Hadramaut, Yemen, right? So sometimes I use interchangeably between Hadrami preachers and Ba'alawi and Habaib. So we need to see the diversity within Hadrami community themselves. So yeah, Hadrami is, yeah, of course, the general term for those coming from Hadramaut, Yemen. And then we have the term Sayyid, yeah, Sayyid or Habib or Ba'alawi, yeah, now becoming very popular in Indonesia, yeah, the term the Habib. But I see the term Sayyid is not really popular anymore compared to, if you compare to, like, let's say in during colonial era, yeah, during colonial era or during Suharto, some Majelis leaders still maintain the term Sayyid, mistaken, yeah, Sayyid. In Kuitang, he still used Sayyid rather than Habib. And later on, this term, the term Habib or Habaib, now becoming more popular than Sayyid. Some scholars like Pandenberg, in his book, he said that we need to distinguish between Sayyid and Habib. Yeah? He said that if you're talking about Sayyid, it means social strata or social status. So those having distant to the Prophet, they could be called, they can be categorized as a Sayyid. And then he said that the term Habib actually it's only attached to the name, yeah, as the, you know, when we put the name in front of somebody, we only put a Habib rather than Sayyid. So let's say, for example, if there is one person, Ahmad, yeah, if you want to, you know, if you want to call him with the familiar name, Yeah, we call him Habib Ahmad, for example. But if you were talking about social status, and then you said, oh, Ahmad is a Sayyid, just to denote that he belongs to a particular social group. In my study, I offer a different explanation, because when I meet officials of Rabita Alawiyah, they said that actually to call somebody Habib, yeah, is like to call a kiai to somebody. So I got one article by Sayyid, who was the leader at the time, Smith, Zain bin Smith at the time, yeah, the chairman of Rabita Alawiyah. He wrote in Republica, he said that Sayyid, he said Habaib is, all Habaibs are Sayyid, but not every Sayyid is Habib. He said like that. So he said that even within the community themselves, they only call Habib to a people or somebody who has high knowledge in Islam, and also have shown good morality or akhlaq. So even within the community, they actually quite worried to see that there are too many Hadrami now claiming that they are Habib, while in their community bukan sembarangan, they say. Yeah, it is only belongs to like senior scholars and so on. So so I try distinguish Habib here as I use Habib here as a particular form of religious authorities besides Kiai. Yeah. So that's why in my book, when I said Habib or Habaib, it only refers to preachers or ulama. Yeah, in my book. When I use Sayyid, so it could be lay people, yeah, or somebody else. Yeah. Yeah. I think as a background, I think we have read. We are familiar about the history of Hadrami. They have migrated to Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and India. I think some said 13th century, 15th century, but of course the coming of Hadrami migrants largely to Indonesia, I think around 19 and early 20th century. And many studies have shown that many Hadrami people, they actually have integrated very well in Indonesian societies. They marry locals and so on. Even they have, worked together with Kiai, yeah, in establishing pengajian. Yeah. I think that a good example is Majelis Kuitang in Jakarta, in which Habib Ali Al-Habsyi also asked local Kiai to join in pengajian. So Ismail Padri Alatas, I think his works have shown how Habaib have integrated with Kiai in Indonesia. Okay, many studies, yeah, I think have proven that, yeah, of course Hadrami or Ba'alawi especially, yeah, they have a big role in Islamization, yeah, in Indonesia. If we, many Sufi preachers, for example, in 13th, 15th century, were coming from Hadramaut. Many of them were Sufi, yeah, or Muslim saints, even be categorized as in several of 9 saints, yeah, Wali Songo. Even though now it is still debated whether they are all Sayyids or all are Javanese, so it is still ongoing debate here. if we ask Sayyid, if we ask Habaib or Rabi Alawiyah, they will have proof that many of these 9 saints actually Hadrami. Yeah. But if you ask Kiai, maybe they have different answer. If you ask Nahdlatul Ulama. So there are many dynamics here, and then I don't know what happens. Yeah. And now we see there is like, there is like a conflict between Habib and Kiai. When I did my research, actually, there was a harmony between Habaib and Kiai. They work together. Yeah? They work together to, to defend traditional Islam, in Indonesia. Okay. Before going to my case, I would like to also say that when I did my research, there were two dominant perspectives used at the time. The first one is urban Sufism. Yeah. I mean, in order to explain, the mushrooming of Muslim groups, I mean, sermon groups in Indonesia. Yeah. At the time, I remember the books also by Pak Martin and Bu Julia Hall, also, and then by Pak Arif Zabari at the time. They said that the emergence of this kind of sermon groups could not be disconnected from the Sufi revival in Indonesia. So that's one explanation. Yeah? And then the second perspective that I have seen is that the one is by Martin Slama. Yeah? Martin Slama said that the dynamics of Hadramaut, also has big impacts to Indonesia, and he said that after 1990, after unification of Yemen, it also had it has affected the new relationship between Indonesia and Hadramaut, because before there was a Cold War, and then Yemen was under socialist regimes, but after it was relaxed, after it was unified between North Yemen and South Yemen, so it facilitated the travel of Hadramis to Indonesia and also Indonesians to Hadramaut. In other words, Martin Slama, he said that the emergence of Ba'alawi or Habaib in Indonesia also a kind of cultural revival among Hadrami. Okay, so in my book I try to offer different explanations. So, and then I have argued in my book. I said that the resurgence of Habaib in contemporary Indonesia is a reaction to external threats which challenge their legislation and in authority. So in my book, I try to see Habaib is not outsiders. In fact, they are one of traditional authorities in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, of course, we have Kiai in Java, we have Ajengan in West Java, Guruta in South Sulawesi, and then Tuan Guru in Lombok. And then why we don't include Habib in this kind of traditional authority in Indonesia? So I try to locate Habaib in Indonesian Islamic traditionalism. So in order to see this new phenomenon, the emergence of Habaib in the public space, so I argue that this phenomenon cannot be disconnected from Indonesian domestic and also global factor. If we go to in 1920s and 1930s, Pak Martin has written a lot about this, about heated debate between modernists and reformists. There was heated debate at the time, and then it becomes cooling down after Suharto, because Suharto, emphasized on economic stability and development and so on. But after the new order era, we have seen a heated debate between traditionalists and Salafi groups, in social media, in public sphere, and so on. There are many books at the time. After New Order era, if you go to bookstores, you have many books about bid'ah, for example. About bid'ah. Even it had been sold in Gramedia. So many books, many websites at the time emerged from Salafi groups. There was Roja, Yufid, Ahsan TV, and so on. And many of these media, they attack traditionalist Muslims by addressing bid'ah to their thought and their practice. So that's why my argument in this book, I maintain that the emergence of Habaib was a reaction, or response to external threats at the time. The main player here, of course, or the main enemy at the time was Salafi group, but also Shiism and Islamist groups. But they always emphasize Wahhabism as the major enemy at the time. So there was a feeling of feeling threat among Hadrami themselves, but also there was a feeling of attack as well within the larger group of traditionalist Muslim. So there at the time there was a growing demand of preachers who defend traditional Islam. So and then we see many Habaib Salman groups, Majlis Ta'lim. We have seen many media by Habaib as well, like Al-Qisah, Al-Qisah in Jakarta. Even outside Jakarta, we see many there are many Majlis pengajian at the time. But the most noticeable one, I think, Habib Nasir bin Fuad al-Musawa. I think he had thousands of followers. And what they did at the time, he tried to reassert traditional Islam, through Majlis Ta'lim, new media, and popular culture. So they had regular activities, every weeks, in which he introduced and even make a regular ziarah, in Jakarta and surrounding. So so this is quite interesting in Jakarta. But what he promotes is a kind of traditional practices among young urbans, and many of his followers actually coming from traditionalist background, but from a low income families. I have met some followers of Majlis Rasulullah, and they always talk about blessing, about barakah. They said, by joining this group, by joining this Majlis, I hope that I can gain blessing in my life, in my study and in my business and so on. The second one, besides reasserting traditional Islam, Habib Nasir and his colleagues also popularized, traditional Islam, or rituals, such as Haul, Maulid, Zikir, and so on. They have, very long Zikir when open their Majlis. In my book, I also introduced one young Habib from Solo, Habib Naufal bin Muhammad Al Idris. Yeah. At the time, he had many followings in Solo, and he was quite prolific. Yeah. He wrote many books about how to defend ziarah, for example. Yeah. He authored 2 books just to counter attack those who criticize what is that, tawassul, yeah, tawassul and so on. So even he organized a mass big event in one mosque in Solo, just to criticize national TV at the time that that consider NU's rituals as bid'ah, for example, by Trans TV at the time. So there was big mobilization at the time, and many rituals connected to these kinds of defending their belief and their practice. Yeah. In my book, I also emphasize that the Habaib, they try to turn these threats into opportunity to them. Yeah. So they try to, they turn this threat into opportunity. Yeah? So they try to, marketize religious products, religious goods. They think this could help traditionalist Muslims to deepen their knowledge about their traditions. Yeah. For example, they sell translated book by Sayyid Muhammad Alwi Al-Maliki. I think this book is very important for Indonesian Muslim. I mean among preachers, because these books really justify many local traditions of Indonesians. Even Habib Rizik, he put the figure of this Sayyid in his pengajian. So in terms of doctrinal defense, justifications, I think Habaib at the time, they worked very successfully, in strengthening, their traditions. And also in their da'wah, Habaib also always emphasize sanad. Yeah, they always emphasize sanad, knowledge change. So this is a kind of challenging new preachers who have no sanad. Yeah, there is no connection to authoritative ulama and so on. And they also promote Hadramaut as a not new. Yeah, they just re-emphasize that Hadramaut as the ideal land of Sunni authority. So they promote that Hadramaut has thousands of saints, of grapes. Yeah, the land is very conducive for building piety for young Muslims. Yeah, it is very different from Saudi, for example. They always said that Saudi was already hijacked by Wahhabism and so on. So promoting this, actually, by promoting Hadramaut and so on, actually they also promoting their authority before Indonesian Muslim audience. So one of the very famous ulama, I think, from Hadramaut now, I think Habib Umar. Yeah? Habib Umar now becomes very popular in Indonesia. When he was invited to do preaching in many places. And in the last visit, I hear that he also visited PBNU. Yeah? So it was quite weird, because before he never went to PBNU. Yeah? But last year I hear from the news that he met some officials in PBNU. It seems that he tried, to build alliance with, to build a new communication, good communication with PBNU. So, yeah. So that was my. So I have shown in my book that Habaib, in Indonesia, why they have become successful in da'wah and marketing, because they use marketing strategy. They use new media to promote themselves. They also understand how to attract young Muslims. They use popular culture, for example, to attract followers. So interestingly, even though they are traditionalists, in category, I mean, even though they are traditional, but they succeed. They succeed in promoting their teaching in Indonesia. Okay, let me give some conclusion here. I'm sorry if not quite systematic here. So I would like to highlight what I have maintained in my book. So the emergence of Habaib, I emphasize in my book, was the result of increasing competition for religious authority. So that's why I use a Bourdieu's concept of religious field. So I see their emergence was in the context of competitive authority in Indonesia at the time. Preaching to strengthen traditional Islam and campaigning against Wahhabism have become avenues for Habaib to elevate their authority and religious capital. The more Habaib promote traditional Islam, the greater their prospect for increasing their authority, social status, and thus economic rewards. So by promoting traditional Islam, actually they also promoting themselves as the more authoritative ulama. Also, I have maintained in my book that Habaib gained their popularity through a distinctive performance enhanced by new media, popular culture, and religious markets. And the last one, I think this is also my contribution, because there are many scholars who emphasize the relationship between Arab and Salafism. So if we talk about Saudi, if we talk about Arab, it will be considered as Salafi. Even though, even some scholars categorize Habib Rizik as Salafi, for example, after 9/11. So in my book, I maintain that the Habaib case indicates that Arab factor, the Arab factors not only strengthens the authority of Salafism, but it also works to assert and shape Islamic traditionalism in Indonesia. So Arabic factor here also works for traditionalist Muslim in Indonesia, because in history, even now when we are talking about about local practices, tahlilan and so on, tawassul and so on, it is very hard, for example, for traditionalist Muslims, to justify with doctrines, for example. But Habaib, with their books and their knowledge, they can, defend their tradition by connecting it to the doctrines and justify that they actually belongs to Islamic practice. So this is all what can I present from my book. So I would like to hear Pak Martin's comments on this, because there are many data I got from Pak Martin, especially from his book on traditional Islam. So really looking forward to hear his response. So thank you very much, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay.
much, Professor John. Thank you for introducing your book and, of course, sharing the key findings of your research, especially related to the internal dynamic within Hadrami community, and also the ideology, and most importantly, the contestation, the Hadrami with other religious groups in Indonesia. Before we come to further discussion, I would like to invite Professor Martin to make a response comment for the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can someone, oh no, I think can anyone hear my voice if I speak like that in the back? Good afternoon. 2 weeks ago I was in Jogja and I was talking with a few friends about what we called the Habaibizatie of Indonesian Islam. And the next day I received a WhatsApp message from Pa Shafiq Hashim, who asked me to come to this discussion and discuss a book about the Habaib and their culture and their the revival of Habaib activism as a counter to the threat to traditionalist Islam. And I received the book as well. So I have spent the past week reading the book, and I have to say, I really like the book. It is a very comprehensive study of the different aspects of the Habaib revival, of Habaib, how the Habaib position themselves in society, how they create their own charisma, and how they manage to insert themselves into the Muslim community, especially into the traditionalist Muslim community. I mean, I had seen several of these things without paying very special attention. For instance, when you visit the graves of the saints of Java, of the Wali Songo and other makam-makam keramat di Java, I noticed a few things. After Reformasi, so in the past 25 years, there has been a tremendous increase in visitation of holy graves. And it is a cross-section of Indonesian society that visits. It's villagers who come to visit, but it's also middle-class ibu-ibu from the big city who go in groups and they combine ziyarat to several holy graves with shopping in the trendiest malls in Jakarta or other cities. I mean, it's part of a middle-class culture. Now, I noticed that at this ziyarah, the holy graves of the Javanese saints are gradually being Arabized. In the first place, there are juru kunci who teach people different doa. The story of who these saints were. I mean, they used to be Javanese saints of perhaps a foreign background with some Arab blood and perhaps coming from Champa, like Sunan Ampel or elsewhere. But in the Habib version of the story that they have been pushing, and I found that they already started doing that in the 1920s, but it became especially popular recently. All the Wali Songo are in fact from Hadramaut. This contradicts all existing Javanese sources about them, but somehow they managed to make people believe that the Wali Songo are part of the Habaib culture. And when we go and we venerate the Wali Songo, we take part in venerating the Habibs. Maulid has always been a very popular practice among traditionalist Muslims. And I wrote many years ago in an article that there is one book that everyone in his life has had recited in his name. That's Barzinji. And when there is an Akika, people used to read Barzinji. And Akika or Barzinji are almost synonymous in traditional usage. But I noticed that in the past 10, 20 years, the Barzanji has gradually been replaced by Simchat Durar, another Maulid written by a Hadrami in Hadramaut, which in content and in religious atmosphere is rather different. In the Barzinji, you still feel the magic of the Prophet's embodiment. I mean, it's the first created Nur Muhammad, which has no shape yet, but becomes embodied, enters the world, and everyone has to get up when the spirit of the Prophet enters his body. It's a form of esoteric interpretation of creation and of the Prophet's role in creation. There are elements of Wahdat al-Wujud, and in the Habaib version, all that mysterious dimension is gone. It's just the story of the birth of the ancestor of the Habaib. So there is, I would almost say, a purification or an Arabification, an Habibification of the of the Maulud. And it is interesting that they have succeeded in doing this in an environment where you have many traditional Qais who know very well the Barzinji and there are a number of other Barzinji-like traditional texts that are still being recited collectively in villages. So, yes, there is a change in the spirituality of the pilgrimage, the spirituality of Barzinji, of Maulud rituals and so on, in which Javanese Islam seems to be assimilating to Hadrami Islam. And to some extent, perhaps, and this is what I think I find interesting in Shamsul Rijal's book, this is perhaps because the Habib revival, which played a role in this, is a response to another development in Indonesia. After the fall of the Suharto regime, various groups that had been underground, like Ikhwan, which became the PK, the Partij Keadilan, later the PKS, and like various Salafi groups, they came to the surface, became very active, became more daring in their criticism of existing traditional practices. And it seemed that Islamic discourse in Indonesia became rather different. In the 1990s, which is a period when I lived in Indonesia, I was fascinated by Muslim intellectualism, which I saw developing. You might say that Salafism and also Ikhwani Islamic discourse are, among many other things, a form of democratization in discourse. Because there are no people who have a special status. There are no saints for the Salafis and for the Ikhwanis. There are, but Habib, everyone is Habib. God loves everybody, right? So, and of course, there cannot be status differences. So Sayyids cannot claim any superiority on the basis of their descent in the Salafi view. And I think also, the position of Qiyai has been attacked. Famous writer of Salafi inspiration, Ahmad Jais Hartono is his name? Yeah. Has this one book against Qiyais, people who are deifying themselves, who are attributing divine powers to themselves. It's fiercely critical of the traditional position of the Qiyai, fiercely critical of various practices that are extremely dear to many traditional Muslims. So traditional Islam was under assault, and the assault was so pervasive that, say, in the first 10 years of the new millennium, I thought this is going to be very effective and it's going to change. NU was going to change. The discourse entered inside NU. Muhammadiyah was changing. Leaders of Muhammadiyah and of NU were said we're being infiltrated by Salafism, by Ikhwanism, but in fact it was people from their own families that were receiving these impulses and brought the discourse, because as a member of Muhammadiyah you have easy access to Muhammadiyah, brought the discourse within and Salafized Islamic discourse both within NU and within Muhammadiyah. I have been trying to look at Salafism, and I came to the conclusion that Salafis, actual Salafis, are not very numerous in Indonesia. There are not many Indonesians who are real Salafis, but most Indonesians have become, to some extent, Salafized. They have undergone Salafi influence. And I wondered, will this go on forever? You may, of course, perceive of Islamic reform as an ongoing project that started hundreds of years ago, and each generation purifies practices that have existed in their own time and makes Islam more and more Puritan. But we look at history, we also see often counter movements where after a period of desacralization of many sacred institutions and beliefs, there is a return of the sacred in our life, where Sufi movements, where charismatic teachers become more influential. There may be perhaps an up and down movement between Puritanism and more spiritual, more mystical versions of Islam. And anyway, what we have been discussing, what is discussed in this book as the Habaib revival, is definitely an aspect of a response to the Salafization and an attempt to counter it. And the Habaib put their own bodies and their own families and their own tradition, their own graves in the way of Salafism. So they promote a cult of graves. I mean, I've often felt, how Islamic is this Habaism? It seems like these people are making a cult of their own families. But it is certainly very strongly opposed and sometimes quite effective against the tendency to Salafism. Many people have a belief. I was grown up in a very Puritan Christian tradition, and rationally, I think very much like Salafis. But besides, when I'm not always rational, I also have emotion, and I feel that my emotions and things when you feel empathy with a certain community, they're doing certain rituals, you feel attracted. You may say it perhaps rationally it makes no sense, but it gives me a sense of a higher spiritual reality. And I think that is what the Habib also are giving to the people in Java, a sense of contact with something that we don't understand, but seems to connect us indirectly with the divine. At least that's what they claim. So, yes, the Habaib became one of the, perhaps that is also connected with the political changes in Indonesia after the fall of Suharto. Before the fall of Suharto, mobilization was not really possible. It was considered as dangerous. And now suddenly, preachers can easily mobilize large groups of followers without having to ask permission to the military first. So these Majlis Rasulullah sermon groups, you call them, I think, preachers groups. There is not much of a sermon going on. Yes, Majlis Ta'lim is a term that I have often heard here in Jakarta in the 1980s and 90s. It was usually for ibu-ibu. It was usually in the neighborhood. And there was a pengajian. There is someone who gives a sermon. And it's a sermon with a certain content. It discusses hadiths, it discusses things in daily life. It is really a sermon that teaches people something very practical, perhaps rather basic, not very profound theology, but there are both religious ideas and there is a social context. Now, what I find in what I have seen of these Habib events is there is not so much a sermon. There is reciting salawat together, It's the Majlis Salawat, Majlis Dhikr, Dua. And if there is a sermon, it is always a sermon. We have to follow the Prophet. We have to be like the Prophet. We have to love the Prophet. There is very little about the message of the Prophet, let alone about a critical analysis of how the message of the Prophet, embodied in a book that has existed for 1400 years, how that can be reinterpreted and applied in practical life and society. That sort of reflection you found in the intellectual discussions in the 1990s, and it seems to have disappeared. And that's certainly not revived by the Habaib. In your introduction already you speak of a religious market in which the Habaib place themselves and quite successfully find a niche for themselves where they are marketing themselves, their ideas, and various objects like T-shirts or jackets or DVDs or whatever. And of course, you're interested in the protection of traditional Islam by these Habib. They are competing with Salafis, with Ikhwanis. They're also competing with Shia, Habib and non-Habib. But what I think you do not emphasize enough is that they're also competing with other traditionalists. They are affecting a change in traditionalist discourse in Indonesia, where the Qais, well, some Qai are also, in fact, of Arab descent, but say the average Javanese Qai is not. Where the Qai's discourse, NU discourse, a new mainstream discourse, is gradually being impacted on or shifting in the direction of a Habib-inspired discourse. Now, there may be a number of reasons why Hadramaut became more popular as a focus of orientation for Indonesian Muslims. I often say Indonesia in the colonial time had two capitals. One capital was Batavia, where the Dutch Indies government seated, and the other capital was Mecca, where many prestigious people resided. There was a huge Indonesian community in Mecca of all ethnic groups. And the great ulama, all great ulama of NU have at least to have studied in Mecca for several years. Since the 1930s, there was an Indonesian Islamic school, the Darul Ulum Islamiyah in Mecca. The last director of the school, Sheikh Yassin Al-Padani from Padang, died in 1990. And there has not been an Indonesian replacing him. So we often say that Saudi Arabia is Wahhabi, but that is not really true. In Mecca, there were always traditionalist teachers. Sheikh Yassin Al-Padang was one of the influential ones. But he died, and he has no Indonesian replacement. The one to whom the Qai then all looked was Muhammad bin Alwi al-Maliki, whom you also write about. He is a Sayyid, but not a Habib.
Habib, sir.
No. He is al-Maliki. He's not from Hadramaut, and he's... Yeah, but I don't think he ever calls himself Habib. People don't call him. He's a Sayyid. It's a different Sayyid tradition. And he is a scholar of books. Although also of prayers and of tarikats. I mean, he has introduced Indonesians at their demand into the tarikat Naqshbandiyah, the Qadiriyah, the Tijaniyah, a few other tariqat that I know of. So he was a source of traditionalist knowledge and Sufi inspiration for Indonesian Qai. But he died in 2004, and he also has no successor. His school no longer exists, like Sheikh Yassin's school no longer exists. The library of Sheikh Yassin's school cannot be found. It has been confiscated by the government. So Mecca as a center of traditionalist knowledge disappeared in 2004. So I think that is an important factor that made it possible for the Habib to say, but there is this other center of traditional Islam, which is Hadramaut. And as you write, Hadramaut, until 1990, was under the control of a socialist government that oppressed the Habaib, that did not accept Habaib culture as acceptable in an egalitarian society. But in 1990, North and South Yemen reunited, and the Habib became liberated. And one young man who benefited most from this liberation was Habib Umar bin Hafid, and there are several stories about how he made up this. I mean, he realized that Hadramaut has always had a vital economic connection with Indonesia. Although there is also Hadrami diaspora in East Africa, a very large diaspora. But Indonesia was really the promised land for the Habib. Hadramaut is dry and desert. It's hot and nothing grows there. And in the Arab imagination, paradise looks like Indonesia. Paradise is green, there are many trees, there are rivers. Indonesia is in the Hadrami imagination, it's a very rich and ideal place. So there has been, from the 19th century onwards, massive emigration to Indonesia. And they went there to make money. And they sent the money back to Hadramaut. Indonesia has supported many institutions in Hadramaut. I mean, Hadramis from Indonesia sending their money back. So for Hadramaut, Indonesia has also been a lifeline. And I think Habib Umar thought of this lifeline when he established his own traditionalist school, Darul Mustafa, and he started inviting people from Indonesia, Malaysia, Patani, southern Thailand, and other regions in Southeast Asia. And he gave them scholarships. You can live, it's a very poor country. You write about a scholarship of $4,000, you pay $4,000, $5,000. You get a plane ticket, return ticket, and you can live for 4 years with $5,000. So, yes. It's surprising that not many more Indonesians are studying there, but many Indonesians went there, both from the Arab communities and from the indigenous communities. And many people have come back and started teaching. Now, it may perhaps not 100% correct, but I always thought that what is called NU Garis Lurus, the conservative wing of NU, is closely connected with returnees from Hadramaut. The man who calls himself Secretary General of NU Garis Lurus, Buya Yahya in Cirebon, studied in Darul Mustafa in Tarim, in Hadramaut. So there is a new Hadrami mission to Indonesia with missionaries who bring an Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah Shafi'i, Sufism-oriented Islam, but a little bit different than NU Islam used to be, a little bit more conservative. Certainly, for instance, in gender relations. Also in social relations, it's quite hierarchical, unless in certain NU circles. So if you go to Cirebon, where people may speak quite familiarly to a Kiai, and many Kiai are simply called Kang, the brother, instead of a very honorific title. Cirebon is quite democratic. Now, the current Habib culture rather conflicts with that more democratic tradition. Another thing that struck me, you bring that out, although you do not say it in as radical words as I'm going to use now. Habib Umar is a very learned man who has read many books. And people really study books. So it is not preacher Islam, it's ulama Islam that is being taught in his ribat, in his madrasa, his pesantren. But I think it is anti-intellectual in its conception of what knowledge is. He teaches knowledge, but in the conception of knowledge that one gets there is The Habib has the knowledge. There is a body of knowledge which is unchangeable. And you can study it and you can have more and more and more of it. But it is not something that can be interpreted independently. It is just there. There is knowledge. It's unquestionable. So if you're a student of Habib Omar, you study that knowledge, you never question the teacher, you never think of alternative interpretations, you just adopt and accept it. In that sense, I would say it's anti-intellectual. I would find, when you highlight two types of activities of Habib Omar, there is the teaching in the Rubat, which is kitab teaching as in the Pesantren, and the other is da'wah, which becomes these massive sermons or salawat, dhikr meetings. Now, I think this is part of a general trend I've seen in Indonesia. In the 1990s, there were, some of you may remember Nurcholish Majid, who took up the concept of pengajian. There were always pengajian and majlis ta'lim, where preachers were speaking to simple audiences. Nurcholish Majid created something called Paramadina, Club Kajian Paramadina, where there was also a pengajian, a religious sermon, but of more profound, more reflecting a different type of reading, perhaps also more critical type of reading. And there was always a second speaker. There were always two speakers. One gave a pengajian and the other gave a critical comment. There was a debate. And there was the implication that knowledge is not something unchangeable, but there are different views of it. There are different ways of accepting, debating it, absorbing it, or rejecting it. So it was a Muslim intellectual which was growing in middle-class circles, certainly not across society, but in middle-class circles in Jakarta, and kemudian later on taken up by youth groups in various university towns. There were similar discussions where other Muslim texts were studied, Islamic philosophers, texts that had been banned in the past, Muslim philosophy, which had long been suppressed in Sunni society, was studied again. People were reading modern writers, critical writers, writers like Ali Shariati from Iran, who had a very sociologically inspired, perhaps also socialistically inspired reading of Islam. There were people reading Muslim Brotherhood type of literature, but also Fazlur Rahman was another Muslim intellectual who became highly influential in Indonesia, and whose influence was reflected in many religious sermons. Now, after the fall of Suharto, somehow, here and there at IAIN and UIN, this type of intellectual atmosphere remains, but a new type of preacher comes up, who are more mediatized. The most popular one that most people still remember is Agim, who also had a message of tolerance, very pleasant to hear. Many non-Muslims loved listening to him. He did also spiritual exercises. He used SMS. He may have been the first to experiment with SMS. He had a communication technology advisor who helped him devise the various ways he used to connect to his following. In Agim, we still find a moral teaching and sermons, lectures with a content. But then very soon there are more Sufi type meetings where the lecture is no longer there. The message is being together, reciting dhikr or salawat or other recitations, doing recitations together, creating an atmosphere of commonality and raising a feeling of spiritual communication through common recitations. And what the Habib do is they take this up and develop it further, and make the recitations very much focused on the Prophet, on the family, the descendants of the Prophet, and especially the Hadrami descendants of the Prophet, or those who claim to be descendants of the Prophet. So I see a shift, which I very much regret, from intellectualism to less and less and less intellectual contact, to only the feeling good sentiment of the mass dhikr meeting. Now, this is still competing in a religious market with many other people offering religious teachings in many different forms. And I, in a way, although I wouldn't say I'm a Salafi, but I find the Salafi discourse and also the discourse of some of the early, the Hijra group in Bandung, Hanan al-Attaki, before he became NU again, in a way that I feel somewhat more rationalism there than in these Habib meetings. So I wonder, is there another form of traditionalist Islam that may carry more intellectual content and still be different from Salafi, still be an answer to Salafism? That would be my question to you, and perhaps also to the audience. You make a few interesting comments on the religious market, on merchandising, and it seems to become an economically quite substantial enterprise in the big majlis. And you also speak about performance. I like that idea. Being a Habib is a performance. You have a nasab, you are a descendant of the Prophet, or allegedly a descendant of the Prophet. You can show your nasab, but as a Habib you have to show and convince people that you are special. So how do you create your own charisma? And I think we can take a lesson from that. If you want to create our own charisma, look at some of the Habibs. Some of it is quite simple. It begins with a big turban. The bigger the turban, the bigger the charisma. I remember a long time ago, 40 years ago, a visit to a Habib who had a big turban, and the assistant of the Habib tells me about a Javanese man who came there and spoke of his dream. He had dreamt of a holy man, and the holy man was wearing a big turban, because the big turban showed how holy he was. And then he saw Habib Bil Faqih, what was his name, in Malang, and he said, this is the man of the big turban. And he was an expert of hadith, this Habib, but simply because the way he presented himself, many people were already persuaded that this was a very special man. Now, you mentioned a few other aspects in this book, so everyone should read the book, I think. They not only dress in the way that they believe the Prophet dressed, but they bring a whole army of people who are dressed the same way. I mean, if it's only one man who dresses this way, it's perhaps not so impressive. But if they come in a few truckloads, with a few truckloads full of people all dressed the same way, it looks much more impressive. Charisma comes in numbers, I think. So they bring a number of people, and they also make sure that their followers, once they're their followers, they dress in a recognizable way. And the emphasis on ziyarah, many of their activities concern ziyarah, pilgrimage. They go to holy graves, not to just any holy grave, but in Jakarta especially, to the Habib graves, because they want everyone to be convinced that Habib's graves are holier than other holy graves. Right? This is, I think, also part of strengthening the charisma of the Habib community. So in a way, for religious studies, this is a fascinating subject. I mean, it is a cult. I'm not sure how Islamic it is, but it's a cult of a family. You might say it's an ancestor cult. The ancestor happens to be the Prophet of Islam, but I mean, there is something very tribal in that Habib cult. Of course, they emerged in a tribal society. They were immigrants into Hadramaut, and they managed, they succeeded to establish themselves as recognized religious authorities in a tribal society. But I think that also made them as a community more tribal. I hope I have said sufficient provocative things. I hope there are some people who really love the Habib and come out and say, you have been too critical. Well, thank you for listening to me so far.
Thank you, Prof. Martin, for your insightful remark and also critical comment on the dynamic of Hadrami in Indonesia. Also the historical linkage to the Hadramaut in Yemen. Well, I believe that the audience already have a lot of questions or comments, so I'd like to invite the audience for Q&A session if you have a question.
Well, you can't see them, but you have to stand up to see them.
Okay. Ms. Anggi? Yeah.
Tes dulu.
Any from the woman? Okay. Ms. Anggi.
Thank you very much. So it's a great presentation by Pak Rijal and Prof. Martin. A quick question. So if we bring that the problem of religious authority to a different ethnicity or civilization, like some Malay wouldn't buy the idea of lineage charisma. Like if you say to someone in Malay culture that I am the descendant of the Prophet, it doesn't really do anything until you prove something that is concrete for them. Like you are, for instance, like you are a rich people, then you gain the charisma. So what if that theory, the problem that you presented in the book by Pak Rijal, being introduced to another kind of society, like more egalitarian society? Thank you very much.
Okay, you can answer it.
Thank you, Mas Anggi. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, you are raising the issue about how Habaib interact with, let's say, moderate Muslim societies, and how do they convince them to be, you know, let's say, followers of the Habaib. As far as I am concerned, I mean, from my my experience, most of the audience, I mean, followers of the Habaib are traditionalists, actually, traditionalist communities. And I think in terms of ethnicity, I think this is related to maybe, let's say, Japanese Muslim, yeah, Betawi, Banten, and so on. But especially Betawi, yeah, I think in Jakarta, Betawi, the Batavian Muslims, let's say Betawi Muslims, they still, you know, maintain their tradition in even in the big cities like Jakarta. So I have met many Betawi, Betawi teens, yeah, from let's say they are very young, maybe from 12 until 16 years old. They spend the time in the pengajian until maybe 1 or 2 o'clock. Yeah. And they said that when I asked them, why don't you go back earlier, because you still study. And they said, we got permission from our parents. They mean this is for kepentingan, akhirat. So we got permission to spend even until the late night to attend the ceremonies. So many of these followers actually traditionalists, but they didn't get maybe enough education in Islamic, in madrasa and so on. But they still have aspirations to continue, or to continue their parents' traditions. So from my experience, most of the audience actually belong to traditionalist Muslims. Maybe there are some, from modernists who convert, I don't know, convert to traditionalists, maybe because they only see, the entertainment aspect and performance. There are some followers who do not really come from traditionalist backgrounds, but they said that they really enjoy, they really enjoy the entertainment. What is that? Fireworks. It is interesting to see in Nurul Mustafa pengajian. Most of the followers actually from the teens. And the Habib is very creative in attracting the followers by, for example, changing the lyrics from dangdut songs into salawatan. So many of the followers actually, some of them, they are not really, their motivation is not really only for learning Islam, but to enjoy, in my book I said to express their youthness, to express their youthness in more Islamic ways. So by joining the sermon group, for example, they can pilot the law. Because they don't wear helmet and so on. They biking in convoy without helmet and so on, bringing the flag with their leaders' image. So there is a sense of identity group, a sense of community. There is a sense of young expression in Jakarta. So I argue in this book that these followers actually not from well-off families, but by joining this sermon group, they actually can occupy. They can occupy the street, urban spaces in Jakarta. So with regards to your questions, I think it is very hard how to bring rationality. To convince people to join Habib, because if you join a Habib community, you have to believe. There are many issues about supernatural things, karama, and so on, and you have to believe what your Habib, your leader, said. So from my interaction with many Habib in pengajian, they always, like Pak Martin said, always emphasize their dream. For example, like Habib Munzir's dream. Many narratives from his followers, they said to me, before Habib Munzir died, Habib Munzir has already had a dream to meet with the Prophet, and the Prophet asked him to retire from his da'wah activity. And he said, you need to take rest and join me. And after that, he died at 40s. So this kind of narratives spread among the followers. And many of them believe this kind of stories. Also, let's say the small things, during the Mahalul Qiyam, in Maulid, everyone stand up. And the Ustad or the Habib always emphasize, now there is a ruh of the Prophet among us. and then one of them bring the parfum and so on. So many stories, many about mystics, supernatural things. I think very bold in this atmosphere. And I agree with Pak Martin that it is very hard to see rational discussion, rational discourse within the Habaib cycle. That's why in my book I said I also distinguish this kind of traditionalists. I state that even though the young NU Muslims now they are becoming progressive during Suharto, by accessing critical discourses and so on, but this kind of group they try to narrowing that NU discourse into more conservative one. So I don't know. I use the title ultra conservative in my book, and I hope it doesn't offend the Habaib groups. So, because if you see, the teachings of the Habaib, it reminds us about a Kiai in classical era, in which the importance of sanat, for example, also tawassul, very much before the debate between 1920s. So it seems they try to revive this kind of more conservative discourses on traditional Islam. Yeah, thank you. That's my answer.
Assalamualaikum, halo selamat sore, saya Ridwan dari Alfa Zeta. Saya mau nanya kepada Prof. Martin, apakah dalam buku ini membahas tentang para peran Sarifah dalam berdakwah Islam di Indonesia, dan kenapa Sarifah ini kurang terkenal dalam dakwah Islam di Indonesia? Cuman hanya yang terkenal tuh Halimah Halimah Al-Indrus. Dan kedua, bagaimanakah apakah dalam buku ini membahas para Habib ini mengelola sosmednya, misalkan TikTok, YouTube, atau IG? Itu terima kasih.
Ya, saya tidak bisa menangkap pertanyaan Anda, tapi bisa Anda melepaskan masker mungkin? Ya.
Kepada Prof. Martin, kenapa sih para Sarifah ini dalam sosmed, dalam dakwah Islam ini tidak terlalu terkenal, kecuali jarang, misalkan contohnya Sarifah Halimah Idrus. Yang kedua, apakah buku ini membahas peran para Habib dalam menggunakan sosmed, misalkan TikTok, IG, ataupun YouTube dalam hal dakwah Islam maupun untuk politik gitu?
Ini kenapa saya tidak membahas itu?
Ya. Apakah buku itu dibahas? Ada bahasannya?
Ya, mungkin karena saya tidak punya banyak bahan. Bagi saya sebagai lelaki mungkin sulit bicara dengan banyak Sarifah, ya. Kecuali Sarifah yang sudah keluar kecuali yang sudah keluar dari budaya mereka itu. Ya, salah satu hal yang menarik, kalau kita di Indonesia melihat seorang perempuan yang memakai cadar, biasanya kita menganggap itu salafi atau tablighi jamaat. Tetapi di kalangan Hadrami dari dulu hijab, nikah itu juga banyak dipakai. Syarifah yang hidup dalam lingkungan itu sulit sekali berkomunikasi dengan orang yang non-syarifah, apalagi lelaki. Jadi saya tidak punya sesuatu informasi khusus mengenai Syarifah yang bisa saya ceritakan kepada Anda. Mungkin saya masih belum dengar. Saya mungkin tidak mengerti pertanyaan.
Okay. Yeah, maybe what I can understand, what I get from your question is that why women, maybe Sarifah is not really apparent in my book. That's what I got. Yeah, actually that's also one of the one of my weakness in this book, it was so hard for me to access the Sharifah community because it is closed for no, it is only it's only for women, not for men. Yeah, actually there are some research about Sharifah by Evanisa and also the new graduate from Netherlands, Istiqomah. Yeah, I think she has done a good research on Sharifah in Ambon. Yeah, because she is a woman, so she's quite easy to access the Sharifah community. Even she went to Hadramaut. But yeah, I agree that some Sharifah actually quite popular now, yeah, like Halima Ali Drus. I think there are some maybe other purpose, I don't know, but I think Halima Ali Drus becoming very popular. I hear that she also used social media for da'wah. But one of the major difference from other ibu-ibu pengajian is that it is very close, very close. Only for women. Even she used chadar, if mistaken, yeah, she doesn't open her chadar. Yeah, I think that's only my weakness. I mean, it is very hard to access this community. But I agree with Pak Martin to the extent that Habaib have succeeded to revise, yeah, this kind of traditional Islam. Because if we have experience in Indonesia, we are talking about traditional Islam, they open, there is no segregation, yeah, between men and women. If you go to pengajian in Kuitang, for example, on Sunday, there are a mix of men and women. I mean, for the male, yeah, for the male preacher. But if you go to Sharifah pengajian, you will find no any men in the pengajian because it's really close. So I think it is. I think also connected to the Arab factors, Arab element here, in which there is very there is segregations between men and women, I guess. Okay.
Thank you. My question is about Ali Jaber. I think the emergence of Ali Jaber was at the same period of the resurgence of Hadrami preachers at the time. But this person was not born in Indonesia. He's conferred his citizenship to Indonesia. So the question is the social setting that allows the Hadrami preachers become more popular is same with the social setting that allows the Sheikh Ali Jaber. Maybe in details, was the audiences of Ali Jaber and the Hadrami preachers is same or not? And in terms of his appearance, like his turban, also different from the Hadrami ones. His turban is identical to the Saudi turban, not like the preachers of Hadrami. Yeah, I think that's my question. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, about Ali Jaber, yeah, I think he already passed away, right? Yeah, and then his brother has emerged as a new preacher as well. Yeah, to be honest, I haven't followed Ali Jaber as as my case of my study, because that within Sayyids, I mean, actually there are variations among Sayyids, among Habaib. Yeah, there is Sunni, there is Shia, even there is Salafi Habaib as well. Yeah, so yeah, if they emphasize Habib title, I mean in their preaching or their da'wah, they will perform, yeah, as Habaib by using turban and so on. So this is indicative of their sainthood, yeah, indicative of their traditions. Very different, for example, from Pak Quraish Shihab. Yeah, Pak Quraish Shihab also Hadrami. He was also Habib, but he also Sayyid. Yeah, yeah. Actually, Habib as well, but he doesn't want to emphasize the Habib. He said, "I said, why don't you put your name Habib in front of your name? You deserve more. You have many collections of tafsir and so on." But he said, I am still low. I mean, to be called Habib is very, it's like big kiai and so on. So he said, if I want to be Habib, I have to perform like General Habib. That's why I don't want to be like that. So I don't know. It is such kind of a rule within the group. Yeah, if you want to join the Habib cycle, it means you have to wear, you have to perform. Yeah, you have to preach like what they do. And also I agree with Pak Martin about the way they do preaching. It seems that they spend more time for reciting salawat and zikir more than the preaching. So when we join the pengajian, it will start with reciting Maulid. Yeah, reciting. Yeah, they said Maulid. But Maulid here, what as Indonesians, what we understand, yeah, from the generation from 90s, that Maulid means okay, we celebrate this during the Maulid, the birth of the Prophet. But for these communities, the Maulid is like regular rituals for them. So they. Before preaching, they always recite the Maulid, hoping that they get blessed, yeah, for that activity. And afterwards, after spending maybe half and 1 hour reciting salawat, and then the main preacher, yeah, usually the main preacher at the end, there are maybe some preachers or maybe some guests in the pengajian, and then at the end, the main preacher will give preaching. But yeah, most of the content of the preaching, I analyze mostly talking about about akhlaq. Yeah, very rare to find that they talk about fiqh, for example, about tafsir and so on. So they only dealing with the issue of akhlaq, for example, Sufism. That's kind of the main thing in our pengajian. Thank you.
Yeah, who is your name? I forgot. Mas Nasir, and then yeah, and one woman here. Make short and concise, please.
Okay, I will try, because actually I have 2 questions to both of the speakers. My name is Muhammad Nasir, MA student from the Faculty of Islamic Studies. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. Actually, my first question goes to Pak Rijal. Okay, ideally speaking, where I come from, and I see that Professor Martin has mentioned something of that nature, that when we talk about the Yemeni preachers or the Hadrami preachers, the typical impression we have of them is like they have that Salafi connotation. But in Indonesia, I think the case is different. For instance, for me, it's very normal. We had teachers from Hadrami, but we don't give them that kind of veneration attitude. We don't do that. So I just want to know, why is it different in the case of Indonesia? And I want you to elaborate on the contestation between these Hadramis and other groups, especially the Salafis. And my second question goes to Pa Martin. Actually, I'm going to tilt the questions towards Salafism more because my thesis is on Salafism. So when you mentioned that, I quote you verbatim, you said that most of the Salafis in Indonesia are not Salafis. They undergone a process of Salafization. I mean, I've come across quite a number of works on Salafism, and I've never seen any scholar using the phrase you just used, that there is. So let me just put it in a more simple way. For me, the line between being a Salafi and being undergone a process of Salafization, kind of shed light on that. Thank you so much.
Well, the first question was for...
Yeah, thank you, Muhammad Nasir. Muhammad Nasir, economist. Yeah, you asked about the dynamics of Hadrami in Africa, who are quite different from Indonesia. What I got from, this is quite new to me as well, to know that, because, if we see the history of migration of Hadrami, I think there are 3 islands. What is that? That they visit, so Africa, India, in Indonesia, and most of them, introduce the teaching of Tariqah Alawiyah. So talking about Tariqah Alawiyah, of course, it will be related with, many teachings, many tasawwuf concepts and practices, rituals, and so on. Even though it is quite open, very different from general tariqah, in which there are disciplines and so on. But that's why I find it quite weird to see that there are the Sayyids or the Habaib in Africa are not like in Indonesia. But maybe actually I still need your confirmations about this. You said that there is no like venerations, you said, in Indonesia. This is quite odd, because in Tariqah, in Sufism, veneration is a must. So I don't know. I have to dig more data more information from your account in Africa. I don't know. Maybe I assume that some Habaib in there, they are not belonging to, maybe they have not graduated from, I don't know, Darul Mustafa or Riba Tarim, because there are many seminaries. There are several key seminaries in Hadramaut. When you graduate from those schools, you will follow the programs, the steps of their teachers. Let's say like Habib Umar's Darul Mustafa, for example. His mission or his main platform is to do da'wah, even though you have, let's say, shallow understanding of Islam, but if you have just basic knowledge of Islam, you have to do da'wah. So that emphasis is to do da'wah rather than to teach in pesantren, for example. And then very different from Riba Tarim. Riba Tarim, in Riba Tarim is like pesantren in Indonesia. They emphasize, more deepening on classical Islam. If you don't get sufficient knowledge on Islam, you don't have to go for da'wah. So even within Hadramaut, there are various schools. There is also one University of Al-Ahqaf. I think one MA student graduated from there, from this university. My point is that there is commonality, but there is also difference among the graduates. But looking forward to discuss about the African Habaib.
I also want to say a few words about your first question. I always had the impression that Habib culture in Indonesia is also a response to the need of Indonesian society. I mean, many of the Habib, the older generation of Habib, not the people who are coming now after the the revival, before the revival, many of the Habib were active in healing and other forms of magic, including black magic. They had a culture that was very much Javanized, I would say. They were like Javanese miracle workers. And that was perhaps a role that was imposed on them. Many of the earlier generation of Hadramis who came here did not leave Hadramaut in order to become Muslim missionaries. They were adventurers who went in search of a livelihood. And they inserted themselves in this society as people with an exotic background and perhaps some privileged knowledge of prayers, effective prayers, and that could be used for all sorts of purposes, including healing and other forms of magic. And the new generation, in fact, tries to purify that. The new generation is not so much into magic and so on. They are preachers. They still insist on the very special position of the Habaib, but they do not share the same Javanese culture of the earlier generations. My comment about Salafism and Salafization, what I said is that there are Salafis in Indonesia. There have been Salafis in Indonesia since the 1990s at least, 1980s perhaps. And they did not initially want to adapt themselves to Indonesian culture. So they really tried to keep an Islam without cultural deformations, as their perception is. Javanese Islam is not pure Islam, it's deformed. But the Javanese culture has turned Islam into something that is not proper Islam. The Salafis want to have a pure Islam by going back to the first generations of Muslims. So initially they resisted against the Indonesian culture, but gradually after, say, it's now 40 years that there are Salafis here, you see that some of the groups of Salafis have established relationships with the Indonesian Ministry of Religious Affairs. There are now Salafi Pesantrens where the Ministry of Religious Affairs does training, and there's anti-terrorism programs carried out there. So these Salafis are adapting themselves little by little to Indonesian culture and thereby becoming somewhat less Salafi. And they will remain small groups. I mean, as a percentage of Indonesian Muslims, Salafis that are attached to one of the wings of Salafi mission here, Salafis who identify themselves by wearing short pants, by having a particular style of mustache, by using a face veil of a certain kind and black abba for their wives. They're often multiple wives. Those are a small group. But Salafi preachers, like one of the most popular preachers in Indonesia, Khalid Basalama, who preaches here in Block M. If you go to Jakarta, in Block M, on top of a shopping mall, there is a huge mosque, and they invite Salafi preachers. Now, the audience there is influenced by Salafi idea, but they're not pure Salafis. So I think there you see a form of Salafi preachings, because it is trendy. This guy, Khalid Basalama, he looks really cool. You know, he's like a jazz musician, you might say. I mean, he can be cool. He is really unconventional. He has his speech, he uses many youth expressions. He uses slang in his sermons. He in his speaking, he shows he's very close to common people on the street, and especially to youth culture. So, and some of your Habib do the same. So that makes him influential. That makes also that many people imitate him. His videos on YouTube get many millions of views. And most of the viewers are not really Salafis, but they are interested in the idea. Sometimes the guy looks good. They like to, he has a good voice, so they like to hear his voice. It's nice listening to him, and it has an impact. So in that sense, I say there is a Salafization. Salafization in the sense of that certain traditional practices are gradually disappearing. I hope this has been clear. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I really apologize because we have very limited time. I will invite one more question from the ladies. If you raise your hand? Yeah. One more question. Yeah. Please.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I would like to thank Sir Shamsul and Sir Martin for the insightful knowledge. There is something that catch my attention about Wahhabi. What is that actually? Is this kind of group is dangerous? Because there is. I found out that many people that labeled someone as Wahhabi, but they don't really know what is Wahhabi is. So to say that someone is labeled by just their appearance, it's not fair, I think. So different people that have more knowledge about this kind of group, that I want to know from your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you about your questions about Wahhabism and Salafisms. Yeah, I think today after religious moderations project, I think there are many Islamist organizations or conservative organizations that under surveillance by the government and so on. So I used to do research as well in Blok M. I met some Salafi pengajian organizers in there, and they raised concern about this, about how they feel quite worried about the labelings of radical terrorists and so on. So yeah, of course, we can identify particular group, Islamist group, with terrorism and so on, because there are many variations within Salafi. There is Jihadi Salafi, Haraki, and also what is that? Quietist Salafi. Yeah. Even now we have here a new term, post-Salafi, by Pak Nur Hadi Hasan. So yeah, there are transformational things within Salafi themselves. I think Pak Martin can talk more about this. But from the perspective of Habaib, when I did my research, many of them, they always emphasize that Wahhabis are not really the true Sunnis. Yeah. They always emphasize that in many pengajians. I attended a pengajian in Habib Rizik, even within Habib Rizik's pengajian. The preacher who has been labeled by Salafi, by some scholars, but he is very traditionalist actually. He even raised series of Salafism in his Markas Syariah in Petamburan. He talked about the history and also try to debunk Salafi understanding of Islam. So, Pak Martin,
I think there is something behind your question, and I'm still wondering what is it, but let me give a try. I have never met anyone who calls himself a Wahhabi. It is always other people who call someone a Wahhabi. And you... Yeah, well, now, why do people call someone a Wahhabi? First is when they criticize certain practices like tahleel after someone died. Well, not all from... Well, yes, if someone criticizes tahleel, he's definitely called a Wahhabi. If someone criticizes, like what the Javanese people often do, offering sesajen, they're sometimes also called Wahhabi, although many NU people also criticize sesajen, right? I remember there was a congress of Muhammadiyah in Balikpapan, in town Brapa, and people were shouting, Wahhabi, Wahhabi. Yes, the Wahhabis are coming. So Wahhabi is the threat. The term Wahhabi, when it's used, usually indicates that people feel that certain practices and certain beliefs are under threat. And of course, the Habibs believe that their special status as people who are Habib, the beloved of God, the special status, to whom we owe respect, whose hands we kiss, whose daughters ordinary people cannot marry, and so on, and that is under threat from Wahhabis. So the Wahhabis have many, the Habib have many Wahhabi enemies. And I think Muhammadiyah has fewer that they would call Wahhabi. Are you a Wahhabi?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Martin and Professor Rijal. Yeah, I really apologize because we have very limited time and we have to end our talk today. So once again, thank you very much for your great presentation. And I would like also to thank the audience for your participation and enthusiasm. I believe that if you have still any concern after this, you can come to discuss with Prof. Martin and Prof. Rijal. Thank you once again and see you in the next book forum. Big applause to our guests with us and welcome to